what is the reason pubs are going bankrupt literally on a daily basis?
Because they're paying too much rent. It's not the rates which are killing pubs off.
The Farmer's Dog, one of England's busiest pubs, shut its doors without warning. On a night it should have been fully booked. Within hours, the internet had already decided why. The celebrity pub experiment had finally failed. It had not. The real reason was a party for the roughly 170 people who run it, spread across a butcher shop, a farm shop, and a repurposed film set most customers never even notice. But that celebration sits right on top of numbers that are genuinely rough. Real losses. Real admissions from Clarkson himself. Let's break down what actually closed those doors, and what the real financial picture looks like. The closure nobody explained. For a pub that regularly turns away customers on its busiest nights, an unannounced closure is not a small thing. The Farmer's Dog sits beside a roundabout on the A40 road in West Oxfordshire, and by most accounts it has rarely had an empty table since it opened. Bookings fill up almost as soon as they become available. Walk-in traffic queues at the door on weekends. For that pub, of all pubs, to go dark without warning on what should have been a full night was always going to draw attention, and it did, within hours. Why would a business this consistently busy choose to close on one of its most valuable nights of the week? That question sat at the center of the speculation that followed. Online reaction moved quickly toward the least generous explanation available, and it did not arrive out of nowhere. The Farmer's Dog had already spent a considerable stretch of the year as a subject of financial scrutiny, following widely covered reporting that the pub was losing money, despite being full most nights it was open. That earlier coverage had established a narrative in the public mind. A celebrity venture, popular with customers, struggling behind the scenes to actually turn a profit. An unexplained closure fit that narrative almost too neatly. Does a pub this exclusive and this heavily booked actually have room to close on a whim, financially speaking? Every table not filled on a night like that represents real, lost revenue. The kind most struggling businesses cannot easily absorb without consequence. That tension is part of what made the closure so immediately newsworthy. It was not just unexplained, it was expensive, by definition. Whatever the reason behind it turned out to be. Commentary online leaned into the assumption directly. The experiment had failed. The numbers had finally caught up with the ambition, and the closure was the quiet, undramatic ending to a story that had been building toward exactly this outcome for months. Some of that reaction was pointed. Some of it carried a note of vindication, as though a closure confirmed suspicions that had been circulating since the pub's very first quarterly figures became public. None of it, as it turned out, was accurate. Is it fair to assume the worst about a business simply because it has previously admitted to losing money? That assumption is not unreasonable on its face. A pub that has publicly discussed its own losses closing without warning is a legitimate reason for concern. But assumptions built on an incomplete picture tend to collapse quickly once the missing piece appears. And in this case, the missing piece arrived within a day, in the form of a very different kind of announcement from the pub itself. There is a pattern worth naming in how quickly that assumption spread and hardened. A single closed door, with no context attached, functions almost like a blank canvas. Observers fill it in with whatever narrative already feels most plausible to them, and in this case, months of prior loss headlines had already primed a very specific story. Nobody needed new evidence to believe the pub had failed. They only needed the absence of evidence, paired with a narrative that had been building for months, to treat silence as confirmation. That is worth remembering later in this story, because the same instinct, filling a gap with the most dramatic available explanation, cuts in more than one direction once the actual numbers come into view. What makes this particular case worth examining closely is not just that the assumption turned out to be wrong. It is that the actual explanation, once it surfaced, revealed something more specific, and more revealing about how this business actually operates than either the doom narrative or a simple correction would suggest. Getting to that required looking past the headline of the closure itself, which turns out to be a considerably longer list of people than most outside observers had any reason to expect. How much of a business's real structure stays invisible right up until an unusual event forces it into view? In this case, quite a lot. Under normal circumstances, nobody outside the company has much reason to think carefully about exactly who works at a single roadside pub, or how many separate ventures might be quietly operating on the same patch of land. It took an unexplained closure and the correction that followed it to make that structure visible at all. And once visible, it changed the entire shape of the story. The real reason it closed. The explanation, when it came, arrived through the pub's own social channels rather than a press statement. A detail that matters, because it suggests the closure was never intended as public messaging in the first place. The farmer's dog had not shut its doors because of financial trouble. It had shut them to hold a party for the people who work there, and the guest list was considerably larger than most outside observers would have guessed, for what looks, from the road, like a single pub building. How many people does it actually take to run a business that most customers experience as one restaurant with a car park? In this case, the figure runs to roughly 170. That number includes kitchen and front-of-house staff at the pub itself. But it does not stop there. It extends to the team running Hops and Chops, a butcher shop operating on the same grounds, staff at the diddly squat farm shop outlet located alongside it, the crew working out of the repurposed Grand Tour tent, the marquee that once traveled the world as a set for Clarkson's Amazon motoring series and is now permanently pitched on the property, the car park attendants managing the volume of visitors the site attracts, and colleagues from Hawkstone Brewery, the company that supplies the pub's beer. Would most regular customers guess that figure comes anywhere close to correct? Almost certainly not. From the outside, the site presents itself as a single, if unusually busy, country pub. The kind of place with a manageable staff roster, working a kitchen and a bar. The actual number tells a different story entirely, one closer to a small rural employer than a single hospitality venue. And that gap between appearance and reality is precisely why the guest list for this particular party matters as much as the party itself. That guest list is the first real clue that the farmer's dog, as a phrase, undersells what is actually operating on that stretch of the A40 road. A single building with a kitchen and a bar could not plausibly employ that many people. What closed for the evening was not one pub. It was an entire small operation spread across several connected businesses that happened to share a site, a car park, and a supply chain, and every person working across that operation was invited to the same celebration. Most customers who visit the farmer's dog for a meal likely never register that they are moving through several distinct businesses rather than one. A trip to the butcher counter after dinner feels like an extension of the restaurant, not a separate retail operation. A stop at the farm shop on the way back to the car feels like part of the same visit, not a different company's till. That blending is, in a sense, the point. The site is designed to feel like a single destination, even though it functions as a small cluster of connected ventures, each with its own staff, its own costs, and its own place on the guest list for an evening built around gratitude rather than promotion. Was this simply good publicity dressed up as generosity, or a genuine gesture that happened to become public? There is no way to fully separate motive from outcome here, but a few details are worth weighing. The event was not framed as a marketing moment in its original announcement. It read, by most accounts, as a straightforward thank you to a large and dispersed workforce, delivered in the same casual tone Clarkson uses across his other public communications. Whether or not it also generated goodwill online is almost beside the point, because the underlying fact does not change either way. Closing a popular, revenue-generating business for an evening to thank the staff running it is not something an owner in serious financial distress typically has room to do casually. That detail creates an interesting tension with everything the public already knew about this pub's finances, and rather than resolving that tension, it actually sharpens the more important question underneath the story. If the pub's numbers really are as difficult as previous reporting suggested, how does an operation under that kind of financial pressure still find room to throw a party for 170 people? The answer is not that the earlier reporting on the pub's losses was wrong. It was not. The answer lies in understanding exactly what those losses actually consist of, and what they do not, which requires looking directly at the figures Clarkson himself has already made public. The truth behind the losses. The financial difficulty at the Farmer's Dog is not speculation or tabloid exaggeration. It comes directly from Clarkson's own accountant, discussed openly as part of his television series covering the farm and the pub. According to those figures, profit before tax at the pub was down by roughly £8,486 across its first 4 months of trading. That is a real, specific, publicly disclosed number, and it applies to a pub that was, by every account, consistently busy across that same period. The specificity of that figure is itself worth pausing on. A vague admission of struggle is easy to wave away as modesty or theater. A precise number, delivered on camera by an outside accountant rather than by Clarkson himself, it is the kind of figure that gets checked against future results, and one that would be awkward to walk back later if it turned out to be exaggerated for effect. Businesses that want to appear more successful than they are, businesses that are genuinely trying to understand and fix a real problem, do exactly that. How does a business lose money while turning away customers for lack of table space? The explanation offered alongside those figures pointed to operating costs, scaling directly with the pub's own popularity. Visitor volume at the site is high enough that managing traffic and parking has become a significant expense in its own right. Reportedly around £47,000 a month spent specifically on parking attendance, a cost that exists purely because so many people are trying to visit the same relatively small stretch of road at once. That is not a hidden inefficiency buried in the accounts. It is a direct, visible consequence of the pub's popularity working against its profitability. Clarkson has been candid about this dynamic in his own words across interviews and newspaper columns, describing the pub's financial reality in blunt terms. At one point, characterizing the venture as a way of turning every £100 that comes in the door into something closer to 94 once all the costs are accounted for. That is not the language of someone concealing a thriving business behind a modest public face. It reads as a fairly direct admission that the core economics of the pub, taken on their own, would a business owner with something to hide describe their own venture in those specific, vague reassurance is the more typical instinct when a public figure wants to protect a brand's image. A specific, slightly self-deprecating comparison involving real currency figures reads far more like an accurate account than a calculated one. Is that admission simply a strategic display of humility from someone unlikely to have real financial worries regardless? It is worth taking seriously rather than dismissing outright. Clarkson has, across multiple public statements tied to this venture, described being caught off guard by how difficult hospitality economics actually are, acknowledging in his own writing that he underestimated the challenge, despite going in aware of the broader pressures facing pubs across the country at the time. That is a specific, repeated pattern of admission, not a one-off aside, and it lines up consistently with the accountant's figures rather than contradicting them. Part of what drives those costs is a deliberate choice rather than an accident of circumstance. The Farmer's Dog operates under a strict British-only sourcing policy. No imported ingredients pass through the kitchen at all, a commitment that extends down to the smallest details of the menu. That policy is not a cost-saving measure. By Clarkson's own account, it makes the food more expensive to produce than it would be under a conventional sourcing approach. not less. Sourcing everything domestically, at scale, for a kitchen serving the volume of covers this pub handles, adds cost precisely where a more conventional operator would look to cut it. So why maintain a policy? The answer appears to be identity rather than economics. The British-only sourcing approach has become one of the pub's defining features, the reason many visitors specifically choose to drive out to a roundabout pub in rural Oxfordshire rather than eating somewhere closer to home. It is a genuine differentiator in a hospitality market where most competitors, particularly larger chains with centralized supply contracts, could not replicate that sourcing model even if they wanted to. Could a national pub chain simply copy this approach if it wanted to compete on the same terms? In practice, not easily. Chains of that scale typically depend on centralized purchasing agreements built around volume and consistency across dozens or hundreds of locations, which makes an all-domestic, no-substitution sourcing policy far harder to implement without rebuilding their entire supply relationships from scratch. That structural difference is part of why the policy functions as a genuine point of distinction rather than a marketing slogan any competitor could adopt overnight. That differentiation has commercial value in terms of drawing visitors to the site, translating into the kind of margin that would offset the costs it creates. Understanding why the business survives at all, then, requires looking past the kitchen entirely, toward the one part of the operation Clarkson himself. Clarkson's survival formula. Clarkson has been unusually direct about identifying the single factor he credits with preventing the pub from serious financial trouble. In his own account, the pub's survival depends heavily on the fact that it exclusively serves his own beer and cider, Hawkstone Lager and Hawkstone Cider, rather than products from an outside brewery. He has described this specifically as the one thing standing between the business and what he termed financial ruin. Why would serving one specific brand of beer make that much difference to a pub's bottom line? A pub buys beer from an external brewery and distributor, paying a wholesale price that already has that brewery's own margin built in, meaning a meaningful share of every pint's retail price flows out of the pub before the owner sees any profit at all. Because Clarkson owns Hawkstone Brewery as well as the pub, that dynamic does not apply the same way. The margin that would ordinarily leave the building with an external supplier instead stays inside the same operation. It is worth noting how unusual it is for a business owner to identify one specific mechanism this precisely, rather than offering a vaguer account about hard work or resilience. Naming the beer relationship specifically suggests Clarkson has actually looked closely at where the pub's money goes, rather than hoping popularity alone would eventually translate into profit. The same pattern of specificity seen in the disclosed loss figures. Is that advantage large enough to offset costs like £8,000 losses and monthly parking bills running into the tens of thousands? Based on Clarkson's own description, it does not fully offset them. His language points toward a business narrowly avoiding serious trouble rather than one comfortably profitable because of this mechanism. The beer margin is not evidence of a secret, thriving profit center. It is closer to a structural safety net, one deliberate advantage, built in from the start, that has kept a genuinely difficult business from tipping into real crisis. There is a broader story just outside the pub that explains why that safety net exists at all. Hawkstone Brewery, as its own separate company, has grown substantially. Reported filings indicate its valuation climbed from roughly £400,000 to more than $3 million in about a year, alongside expansion into continental Europe. That growth belongs to the brewery as a business in its own right, not proof of the pub's individual profitability. But it explains why Clarkson had a functioning, growing beer brand to lean on in the first place. It inherited it from a separate venture, already working well by the time the pub needed it. Would the advantage exist at all if the brewery had been struggling instead of growing? The pub's survival depends just as much on a completely separate business succeeding first. Does owning your own supply chain solve the underlying problem, or just soften its edges. For the farmer's dog, the evidence points towards softening rather than solving. On the record, from Clarkson's own accountant, what the brewery relationship appears to have done is buy the business breathing room to keep operating while those pressures get worked through. A meaningfully different story than the one many assumed when the doors closed without warning, and one that leaves open whether those underlying costs ever get resolved directly. The reality behind the headlines, laid out in full. The picture that emerges from this story is considerably more specific than either the failure narrative that spread when the pub closed, or a simple correction insisting everything is actually fine. The Farmer's Dog is a business that has genuinely struggled with the basic economics of hospitality, by its owner's own repeated admission, driven by real and substantial costs, and to a sourcing policy chosen for reasons beyond pure profitability. It has also had one significant structural advantage available to it from the start, in the form of a brewery relationship that keeps a meaningful share of beer margin inside the business, rather than sending it elsewhere. Neither fact cancels the other out. Can a business genuinely be both a financial struggle and a survivable one at the same time, without contradiction? It can, and this appears to be a clear example of exactly that combination. The losses are not fabricated or exaggerated for sympathy, and the survival is not proof of hidden success. They are two accurate descriptions of the same business, observed from different angles, and treating either one alone as the complete picture misses what is actually happening on the ground. Does a business that is honestly struggling have any business throwing a party for its entire staff? Framed as a pure financial decision, the timing might look questionable. Framed as a statement about priorities, it reads rather differently. A business genuinely on the edge of collapse typically cannot spare an evening's revenue and staffing capacity to celebrate rather than operate. Doing so requires enough underlying stability that the pub could close for an evening specifically to thank 170 people, spread across several connected ventures most customers never think about, suggests a business that is difficult. What actually changed between the loss figures making headlines and the pub closing to throw a party? Nothing in the underlying finances appears to have shifted dramatically in that window. The costs described by the accountant were not resolved, and the pressures Clarkson has described publicly did not disappear. What changed was simply that a business under real financial strain reached a point where it chose to spend one evening on its people rather than on its books, which is a decision available to businesses that are stretched, not just to businesses that are comfortable. The mainstream coverage that treated the closure as evidence of failure missed that distinction entirely, largely because it never looked past the surface-level contrast between an unexplained closure and prior loss headlines. The more accurate story required connecting several separate threads: the accountant's own disclosed figures, Clarkson's own public admissions about the difficulty of the venture, the specific mechanism behind the one advantage he has credited with keeping the business upright, and the actual guest list behind an evening that had nothing to do with financial collapse and everything to do with the people who show up to run several connected businesses every single day. That gap between the quick, surface-level read and the fuller picture is worth sitting with beyond this one story. A closed sign on a door is genuinely ambiguous. It could mean failure. It could mean a private event. It could mean any number of ordinary explanations that have nothing to do with the business's health at all. Treating an unexplained gap as confirmation of the worst available narrative is a habit that extends well past this particular pub, and it is worth noticing how easily an entire online conversation formed around an assumption that turned out to be, in every specific respect, incorrect. What does this story ultimately say about celebrity-backed hospitality ventures more broadly? Perhaps only that the gap between public perception and actual financial reality tends to be wider and more specific than either the enthusiastic coverage or the skeptical coverage usually allows for. The Farmer's Dog is neither the runaway celebrity cash grab some assumed, nor the secretly struggling failure others expected when the doors went dark. It is a business genuinely fighting for its own profitability, propped up by one real advantage its owner built deliberately, that still found room, even under that pressure, to close for a night and say thank you to the people who keep it running. A closed pub door told one story. The real numbers told another. The farmer's dog is not secretly printing money, and it is not quietly failing either. It is a business fighting for every pound, kept upright by one advantage its owner built on purpose, still generous enough to close for a night and thank the people running it. That combination is rarer than either headline suggested. The next time a business goes quiet without explanation, the silence probably is not confirmation of anything. If this changed how you read a closed door, leave a like, drop a comment with your take, and subscribe for the next investigation.